The air inside St. Augustine Cathedral was thick with the scent of roses and polished wood, the kind of mixture that only came from months of preparation and a fortune spent on flowers, candles, and decorations. Olivia Carter adjusted her veil as the organ swelled and the congregation rose to their feet. She was 29 years old, one of the youngest neurosurgeons at Memorial Hospital, and she had convinced herself this was the happiest day of her life. The aisle stretched long before her, lined with friends, colleagues, and dignitaries from the medical world and business circles. At the far end, standing beneath a massive arch of white lilies, Daniel Miller waited with a polished smile. Daniel was 32, a rising executive in a pharmaceutical company, broad-shouldered in his tuxedo, a man admired by nearly everyone in the city. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she walked slowly forward, each step echoing against the marble floor. The pews were filled with 250 guests, some whispering about Olivia's remarkable career, others about Daniel's charm and success. Camera flashes lit the moment like bursts of lightning, capturing every movement. Her father sat proudly in the front row, her mother dabbing tears from her eyes, both believing their daughter had secured not only love but stability. Olivia's hands trembled, but she told herself it was just nerves, the natural weight of a life-changing commitment. She had dreamed of this walk since childhood, though never imagined it would feel so overwhelming. Halfway down the aisle, as she caught sight of Daniel's smile, something unexpected shattered the sacred calm. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the cathedral banged open with a thunderclap, startling everyone. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Emily Carter, Olivia's older sister, stormed in. At 34, Emily was a stark contrast to Olivia. Where Olivia embodied grace and composure, Emily looked disheveled, her hair pulled back hastily, her dress rumpled as though she had run for miles. But the most shocking detail was the metal gas can clutched in one hand and a lighter in the other. Before anyone could react, Emily sprinted down the aisle with terrifying determination. The congregation erupted in confusion, voices rising in protest and disbelief. Some shouted for security, others for the priest to intervene. Olivia froze, rooted to the spot, eyes wide as she tried to understand what was happening. Daniel raised his hands, his confident posture faltering as Emily skidded to a stop near the altar. With a swift motion, she unscrewed the gas can's cap and flung the liquid across the flower arrangements, across the carpet, and toward Daniel himself. The sharp chemical stench of gasoline filled the cathedral, overwhelming the scent of roses. Guests gagged and coughed, covering their faces with programs. Then Emily struck the lighter. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a roaring blaze erupted. Flames leapt from the altar, devouring flowers, cloth, and decorations. The sound was a living creature crackling and hissing as orange light painted the vaulted ceiling. Screams tore through the crowd as 250 people surged toward the exits, pushing and stumbling over one another. Olivia stumbled backward, heat licking at her gown. She smelled fabric scorching and looked down in horror as the hem of her wedding dress caught fire. Panic shot through her veins. Someone yanked her back, smothering the flames with a jacket, but the terror was already etched into her memory. Her veil curled and blackened at the edges, smoke stinging her eyes. She coughed violently, vision blurred by tears. At the center of the inferno, Emily screamed words that sliced through the chaos. Her voice was raw, desperate, and fueled by something more than rage. "He is killing her! He is poisoning Olivia! Check her glass!" The words echoed through the cathedral, carried above the roar of fire and the shrieks of fleeing guests. Olivia's heart lurched as she processed them. Poisoning! She stared at her sister in disbelief, confusion crashing against terror. Around them, people pulled children close. Elderly guests stumbled in panic. Bridesmaids clutched one another, sobbing. The priest dropped to his knees, clutching his rosary, praying loudly for protection. Daniel, his tuxedo flecked with gasoline and his face illuminated by firelight, tried to lunge toward Olivia, but several groomsmen blocked him. He coughed, choking on smoke, but his eyes remained locked on Olivia with an expression she had never seen before. It was not fear, not love, but something cold and furious. Olivia felt her legs buckle. For months, she had dismissed her shaking hands, her frequent headaches, her hair falling in clumps onto her pillow. She told herself it was the pressure of balancing her surgical residency and planning a wedding. Now, with Emily's words searing through the panic, doubt twisted her stomach. Guests cried out for someone to call 911. Phones were already raised, frantic voices reporting fire assault and chaos. Security guards rushed forward, tackling Emily to the ground, trying to wrench the lighter from her hand. Blood streamed from her nose as she fought against them, still shouting through clenched teeth. "She is not safe! He is killing her!" For Olivia, the world tilted. The cathedral that once felt like a sanctuary now resembled a burning trap. Her sister, who she had not spoken to in weeks due to bitter disagreements, was now the figure standing between her and a truth too terrifying to face. Guests pushed past her, some weeping, others cursing Emily. Her father screamed at Emily, calling her insane, while her mother sobbed uncontrollably in the front pew. The flames raged higher, devouring the altar. Olivia clutched her chest, torn between disbelief and the undeniable signs she had ignored for so long. Emily might have been reckless, might have destroyed the wedding, but there was a haunting conviction in her voice. For the first time, Olivia wondered if her sister was not her enemy, but the only person fighting to save her. The cathedral that had once been filled with music and solemn vows now erupted into pure chaos as the fire devoured the altar and guests trampled over one another to escape. Olivia barely caught her breath after the flames had been smothered from her gown when she saw her mother collapse forward onto the polished pew, her face pale and drenched in tears before fainting entirely. Her father shouted hoarsely at Emily, his voice cracking from both smoke and fury, accusing her of destroying the most important day of their family's life. The sound of his rage blended with the sobs of bridesmaids whose mascara streaked down their faces as they clung together in disbelief. Daniel stumbled backward, his tuxedo stained and his cheek reddened from the heat, but even in the chaos, he managed to clutch his chest, coughing heavily and portraying himself as the tragic victim of Emily's insanity. He bent forward, hacking and choking on smoke, his shoulders shaking as though he had taken the brunt of the attack. Several women near the front screamed his name, rushing to his side as though he were a hero wrongfully punished. Olivia felt herself pulled in two directions, the confusion gnawing at her chest because Daniel looked so convincingly harmed while Emily fought like a cornered animal beneath the weight of 3 security guards. Blood dripped from her nose, and yet her voice did not falter. She kept crying out that Olivia was in danger, that her hands were shaking not from nerves but from poison. The words cut Olivia deeper than the flames ever could. She looked down at her fingers, trembling uncontrollably, something she had ignored for weeks. She had attributed the symptoms to exhaustion from endless surgeries and late-night planning sessions, but in this moment, her heart pounded as she realized Emily had noticed something she herself had not dared to face. The guests, however, did not see this. They screamed insults at Emily, some calling her jealous, others calling her deranged. One older woman hissed that Emily had always been bitter because she was unmarried and overshadowed by her brilliant younger sister. Another man, a business associate of Daniel's, shouted that Emily belonged in an asylum. The narrative in the room tilted heavily against her. Olivia's father bellowed louder than the rest, his voice echoing as he commanded the guards to drag Emily out to end the madness before someone else was hurt. Daniel played the role of the wounded groom perfectly, holding a handkerchief to his burned cheek while coughing into his fist. He staggered toward Olivia, extending a hand as though pleading for her trust, and the image pierced her with guilt. How could she stand against the man she was about to marry, especially with hundreds of eyes judging her every move? She wanted to scream for silence, but her throat locked tight. Her mother regained consciousness with the help of a bridesmaid, fanning her sobbing uncontrollably as she clutched at Olivia's father, begging him to stop the shouting, but his anger was uncontrollable. He roared that Emily had cursed their family, that she had humiliated them before colleagues and officials. Olivia's chest ached. She remembered the years of rivalry, the bitter words exchanged over holidays, the times Emily had accused her of being blind to people's true natures. Was this just another bitter performance, or had Emily truly sacrificed herself to reveal something monstrous? Her mind spun as guests cried louder. Children wailed, pressed against their parents' shoulders. The flower girl, no more than 7, hid her face in her hands, traumatized by the sight of flames and screaming adults. The groomsmen, who had restrained Daniel before, now turned on Emily, pinning her harder to the floor, one of them shouting that she should be arrested for attempted murder. Still, she shouted through blood and tears, pointing at Olivia with shaking hands, insisting the tremors were not from stress, but from a slow death Daniel had orchestrated. Olivia's vision blurred. She remembered waking up nauseated 2 weeks earlier, Daniel handing her a glass of water and telling her she was simply overworked. She remembered finding strands of hair on her pillow and Daniel laughing that wedding planning stole beauty sleep. Each memory, once harmless, now pulsed with suspicion. But how could she believe Emily in this moment when the entire cathedral, including her own father, branded her sister a lunatic? Daniel coughed again, clutching Olivia's arm as if to steady himself, whispering that her sister had ruined everything, that she was sick and needed help. His touch, once a comfort, felt cold and constricting. The crowd sympathized with him, murmuring encouragements, some even applauding his strength for enduring such humiliation. The divide was clear. Daniel appeared as the martyred groom, Olivia the fragile bride, and Emily the villain who had attempted to destroy it all. Olivia's father ordered the guards to hand Emily over to the arriving police, his face red with fury. As they dragged her toward the back of the church, her voice cut through the clamor one final time, hoarse but filled with conviction. She shouted that Olivia was being poisoned, that if someone checked the champagne glass, they would see the truth. Her words struck Olivia like a stone in the chest, but before she could react, Emily was yanked through the doors, disappearing from sight. The guests erupted again, some clapping as though evil had been vanquished, others muttering prayers of thanks. Olivia stood paralyzed, caught between 2 collapsing worlds, the family that saw Emily as a destroyer, and the memory of every unexplained symptom in her own body. Daniel pressed closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders as though shielding her, but his grip was tighter than comfort should have been. She looked into his eyes, expecting to see love and concern, but found only calculation behind the glassy sheen of his tears. A shiver ran down her spine. The cathedral smelled of burned fabric and smoke, the once magnificent altar reduced to blackened wreckage, guests coughing and trembling as firefighters rushed past them. And through the roar of confusion, Olivia's thoughts were consumed by one impossible question. Had Emily truly tried to ruin her life, or had she just saved it? The cathedral still smoldered, the once pristine air now choked with smoke and the bitter sting of gasoline. Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs as firefighters doused the last embers at the altar, their hoses cutting through the chaos, while police ushered shaken guests out into the daylight. The echo of her sister's words would not leave her mind, repeating over and over until they drowned out everything else. Poison. Death. Check her glass. Emily's accusations hung like smoke in Olivia's lungs. Her father continued pacing furiously, ranting to officers that Emily needed to be charged with attempted murder and arson, that she had destroyed not only his daughter's wedding, but their family's reputation. He demanded her immediate arrest, his voice booming in the cavernous cathedral. Olivia's mother clutched a rosary, whispering frantic prayers through sobs, torn between terror for one daughter and fury at the other. Daniel leaned heavily against a pew, his hair damp with sweat, his face glistening with supposed pain. Several guests hovered around him, dabbing at his burns, offering sympathy, praising his composure. To anyone looking, Daniel appeared the brave groom who had survived an insane sister's rampage. Yet Olivia noticed the smallest crack in his facade, the flicker in his eyes when Emily's voice had shouted the word poison. It unsettled her, though she tried to bury it. Then, in the chaos, an officer raised Emily's phone, confiscated from her when she was dragged away. The screen was still lit, a message thread open. The detective scrolled quickly, then frowned. Olivia caught sight of it, her breath catching. The texts were between Daniel and a number labeled simply as Martin P. The conversation was explicit, blunt, and damning. Increased dosage this week. She is tolerating too much, needs symptoms to accelerate. Another read, smoothie works best. Makeup is slower but steady. Must time final dose for ceremony. The officer read aloud in disbelief, the words ricocheting through the ruined cathedral. Gasps rose from the remaining guests, their faces shifting from sympathy to shock. Olivia staggered backward, the veil slipping from her hair. Her knees threatened to give way as reality struck like a hammer. She grabbed her scalp with trembling fingers and felt clumps of hair come loose. Her stomach lurched with nausea. The memories aligned with the texts, her endless fatigue, the confusion in surgeries when instruments blurred the mornings she could barely lift her head. All of it she had excused as stress, yet here was proof that her body had been under siege. Daniel's voice cut through the silence, sharp and desperate. He shouted that the texts were fabricated, that Emily had doctored them to frame him. He insisted Martin P. was a stranger, not a contact of his, and that the whole conspiracy was insane jealousy. But Olivia saw fear beneath his words, a panic he could not conceal. Emily's voice carried again from outside, where she was held muffled but still audible. She screamed that Daniel had been dosing Olivia's vitamins, her food, even her makeup since February. Her raw desperation forced the guests to reconsider, whispers turning into fearful murmurs. Olivia's colleagues from the hospital exchanged worried glances. One leaned closer to another and whispered that thallium poisoning often presented with tremors, hair loss, and disorientation, the very symptoms Olivia had been battling for months. A terrible clarity cut through her fog. Olivia's father tried to shout the whispers down, declaring Emily a liar, but his voice wavered as more people began muttering agreement. Daniel's confident posture slipped further. He snarled at the detective, demanding the phone be dismissed as evidence, his composure unraveling. Olivia felt sick watching him. Her mind reeled back to nights when Daniel had insisted on preparing her dinner mornings, when he had blended smoothies afternoons, when he had replaced her skincare products with gifts he said would make her glow. She remembered his constant reassurances when she felt weak, telling her to push through for the wedding. Each memory stabbed her heart with betrayal. The guests began to see the truth too. The image of Daniel as the victim cracked under the weight of evidence and suspicion. A bridesmaid stepped forward, voice trembling, admitting that she had seen Daniel slip powder into Olivia's water at a rehearsal dinner weeks ago, but thought it was a vitamin supplement. Another guest recalled Daniel pushing Olivia to sign forms she barely read, her mind clouded by fatigue. Olivia's hands shook violently, tears cutting tracks through her smoky makeup. She turned to Daniel, searching his face for denial, for love, for something human. Instead, she saw calculation hardening into rage. He spat words at her, accusing her of listening to a jealous sister, insisting that she was ruining his life. But his fury only confirmed what she already felt in her bones. Emily had been right. Olivia crumpled against a pew, the tremors in her body worsening, the pieces of her life snapping apart in front of 200 witnesses. The cathedral that had been meant to sanctify her marriage had instead revealed a monstrous deception. The priest, pale and trembling, whispered prayers while staring at Daniel as though seeing the devil himself. The detective held up the phone again, scrolling further to reveal photographs of chemical containers, receipts for online purchases of thallium compounds, and discussions about lethal doses. The guests recoiled as if physically struck. Olivia clutched her head, the world-spinning nausea clawing at her throat. She wanted to vomit, to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. She stared at Daniel, her fiancé, the man she had chosen to trust with her life, and saw not love, but a predator exposed. In that moment, she realized Emily had not destroyed her wedding. She had saved her from a coffin disguised as a marriage. Yet the horror was not over. Daniel lunged suddenly, ripping the phone from the detective's hands and hurling it to the marble floor, shattering the screen. His mask fell completely, his eyes wild, his breath ragged. He shouted that none of it mattered, that Olivia was already his, that no one could stop what had been set in motion. Panic surged through the room again. Olivia's chest tightened, her pulse racing so fast she thought her heart might burst. The guests gasped. Officers drew closer, and Emily's muffled screams outside grew more frantic. The lines had been drawn. Olivia's world had shattered, the truth unveiled for all to see, and the man she once thought her future now revealed himself as her executioner. The cathedral smelled of scorched fabric and gasoline. and the smoke still clung to Olivia's hair as the crowd shifted uneasily, caught between disbelief and dawning horror. Daniel's outburst had torn the last veil from his face, yet many clung to denial, desperate to believe that the polished groom could not be the monster described in those damning texts. Olivia's body trembled uncontrollably, her shoulder aching from where she had been dragged back from the flames. Emily's voice echoed again from outside the cathedral, screaming for someone to test the champagne, and though muffled, the urgency pierced through the noise of crackling embers and crying guests. An older man, one of Olivia's mother's colleagues, stepped forward toward the wedding table where the untouched glasses still sat glittering under the chandeliers. He was a biochemist who had spent decades analyzing toxins. He raised the flute intended for Olivia, dipped his finger into the liquid, and sniffed cautiously. His expression shifted instantly, his face contorting with disgust. He exclaimed that the champagne reeked of metal, a tang that no celebratory drink should carry. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones lit up again, guests frantically searching for symptoms of thallium poisoning their whispers, turning into shouts as they compared Olivia's visible trembling, her pallor, and the hair that had fallen in clumps since early spring. Olivia's stomach clenched with terror, her mind racing through months of unexplained sickness. Every detail now aligned with the word poison. Daniel's face twisted as the biochemist called out, his finding his carefully constructed mask unraveling completely. He tried to bolt toward the sacristy door, but two groomsmen grabbed his arms, holding him back. The struggle was vicious. Daniel wrenched free with surprising strength, snatching the gleaming knife from the cake table. His burned hand gripped the hilt, and before anyone could stop him, he lunged at Olivia. The cathedral froze in collective shock as he wrapped his arm around her, yanking her against his chest, pressing the knife hard to the side of her throat. The metal blade dug into her skin, sharp enough to draw a thin line of blood. The heat from his burned chest pressed against her back, his breath rasping in her ear, reeking of smoke and rage. "Stay back or she dies," he snarled, his voice stripped of all charm, cold and ruthless. The officers who had been moving toward him halted, their hands hovering near their holsters, but unable to risk a shot. Olivia's body stiffened as panic seized her lungs. The once majestic cathedral had become a theater of terror, hundreds of witnesses frozen in disbelief as the groom threatened to murder his bride before their eyes. Her father shouted Daniel's name, pleading for him to stop, but Daniel's gaze was void of mercy. He hissed that if he was going down, he would take Olivia with him, that the poison had already seeped through her system and she was as good as dead. His grip tightened around her neck, choking her breath. Olivia's vision blurred as tears mixed with smoke in her eyes. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body felt heavy, weakened by weeks of toxins coursing through her veins. Still, somewhere inside her, a spark of resistance burned. She forced herself to speak, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry. She told him that everyone knew the truth now, that every witness had heard the evidence, seen the signs, smelt the poison. Killing her would not erase the proof. Daniel laughed, a bitter sound that made the hair on her arms stand. He spat that God had abandoned him years ago when the debts piled high and the only way out was through her death. His words chilled Olivia's blood. He admitted openly before the crowd that she was his salvation, his way to riches through insurance and stolen accounts. The congregation gasped, some weeping, others praying loudly. The priest stepped forward slowly, hands raised, urging Daniel to release her, begging him to think of his soul. Daniel only sneered, dragging Olivia backward toward the side doors, using her as a shield. The officers edged closer, their eyes trained on his burned hand that shook slightly with the knife. Olivia's mind raced. She remembered the countless times she had assisted in emergency surgeries, moments where seconds determined life and death. She had learned to act even when fear threatened to paralyze. Summoning every ounce of strength, she twisted her body suddenly and rammed her elbow into his injured ribs. Daniel grunted in agony, the pain making his grip falter for an instant. Olivia dropped her weight downward, twisting out of his arm just as the knife sliced across her shoulder. Pain seared through her hot and wet, but she kept rolling onto the marble floor. Officers lunged instantly, tackling Daniel to the ground. The knife clattered away, sliding across the floor. Daniel thrashed wildly, his burned hands leaving bloody streaks as he fought like a cornered animal. But sheer numbers overwhelmed him, and within moments, his arms were wrenched behind his back, cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. Olivia lay gasping on the cold marble blood soaking through her gown, vision spinning. EMTs rushed forward, pressing gauze to her wound, urging her to stay awake, telling her she needed immediate treatment for the poisoning. Emily broke free of the officers outside and burst back into the cathedral, collapsing to her knees beside Olivia, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. She cried that she had no choice, that no one would believe her otherwise. Olivia reached for her sister's hand, squeezing weakly, torn between gratitude and anguish. Around them, the guests stood in stunned silence, the grandeur of the cathedral reduced to ruins, the air filled with smoke and the lingering smell of gasoline and metal. The truth had been laid bare, the evidence undeniable, but the cost was carved into Olivia's flesh and her memory, forever. The ambulance sirens wailed as Olivia was rushed away from the cathedral, her vision dimming in and out as she clutched her wounded shoulder. Every bump in the road sent pain shooting down her arm, and every tremor in her hands reminded her that the poison still flowed through her body. At her side was Dr. Marcus Lee, an ER physician from Memorial Hospital who had been a guest at the wedding and jumped into action the moment chaos erupted. He pressed gauze firmly against her wound and spoke to her in a calm, steady voice, explaining that she would need immediate blood tests and treatment for thallium exposure. Olivia's mind spun with fragments of memory. Emily's screams, Daniel's knife pressed to her throat, the texts on the shattered phone. When they arrived at the hospital, orderlies wheeled her into a brightly lit trauma bay, the smell of antiseptic overwhelming after the smoke and gasoline. Dr. Lee ordered chelation therapy immediately, the only way to bind the heavy metal in her system before it caused irreversible organ failure. Nurses worked swiftly, inserting IV lines, drawing vials of blood, and hooking her up to monitors that beeped frantically with her erratic heart rate. Olivia wanted to close her eyes and disappear into darkness, but every time her lids drooped, she remembered Daniel's hiss in her ear, promising she was already his. Emily appeared in the doorway minutes later, her face bruised and streaked with blood, but her eyes blazing. She carried a notebook clutched to her chest, the pages worn and filled with Daniel's handwriting. She explained in breathless words that she had broken into his office weeks earlier, desperate to find proof when the police ignored her. Inside a locked drawer, she had discovered Daniel's private journal, meticulously detailing every dose he had administered to Olivia since February. Each entry listed symptoms, observed calculations of lethal thresholds, and projections of how much longer Olivia could survive before her collapse would appear natural. Emily placed the notebook into Dr. Lee's hands as detectives entered the room, their faces grim. They began photographing each page, every entry more chilling than the last. Morning smoothie half-dose hair loss increasing. Evening vitamin capsule added powder. Confusion setting in. Another read, Insurance policy confirmed $5 million. Wedding is the perfect stage. She dies. I grieve, I collect. Olivia's stomach twisted as she listened, the reality of her fiancé's betrayal more suffocating than the poison itself. Detective Ramirez, a seasoned investigator with lines etched deep into his face, asked Emily why she had waited until the wedding to act. Emily's voice broke as she described her visit to the local police 2 nights before, how she had shown them the journal, but the report had been buried by the chief himself, Daniel's uncle. Instead of investigating, the chief had called Daniel directly, warning him of Emily's interference. That betrayal had forced Emily into desperation, leaving her convinced that only a public confrontation could stop the wedding before Olivia drank the final fatal toast. Detective Ramirez's jaw tightened as he listened, fury simmering in his eyes. He promised Emily she would not be punished for her desperate act, not when it had exposed an attempted murder. Within hours, state authorities took over the investigation, stripping the local Department of Control. Officers raided Daniel's apartment and office, uncovering more containers of thallium hidden in vitamin bottles, as well as encrypted files on his computer containing financial transfers. It became clear that Daniel had been siphoning money from Olivia's accounts in small amounts totaling nearly $70,000 over 6 months. He had also secretly applied for credit cards in her name, racking up debt while she grew too sick to monitor her finances. Olivia listened numbly as Dr. Lee explained her blood results showed dangerously high thallium levels, yet there was still time to reverse some of the damage if treatment continued aggressively. Her organs were stressed but had not yet failed. She would need weeks of chelation therapy and constant monitoring, but she had survived the immediate danger. Still, the tremors in her hands might never fully disappear. Emily stayed at her bedside, refusing to leave, even when officers pressed her for more statements. She held Olivia's hand, whispering that she had fought because she could not watch her sister waste away under the illusion of love. Olivia wept silently, torn between anger at the chaos Emily had caused and gratitude that her sister's madness had in fact saved her life. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office moved quickly. Daniel faced charges of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated assault poisoning fraud, and identity theft. The weight of evidence piled higher each day. Detectives secured digital receipts of thallium purchases made with cryptocurrency traced to Daniel's accounts. They found correspondence with Martin P., a pharmacist willing to supply controlled compounds in exchange for money. The pharmacist was arrested within 48 hours, caught trying to flee the state. Under interrogation, he admitted to providing Daniel with chemicals and dosing instructions, though he claimed he had not believed Daniel would actually follow through. His confession only deepened the case. Back at the hospital, Olivia endured round after round of treatment. The medication burned as it entered her veins, leaving her nauseated and exhausted. Her reflection in the mirror showed hollow eyes and thin hair, but beneath the frailty there was a spark of determination growing stronger. She knew she would testify that she would not allow Daniel's lies to define her. The public learned quickly of the case news spreading across television and newspapers. Headlines screamed about the shocking wedding turned crime scene about the neurosurgeon bride poisoned by her own groom. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for photographs. Olivia's father tried to shield her from the attention, but even he could not hide the shame etched on his face for not believing Emily sooner. Her mother sat silently at her bedside, praying and stroking her hair as though she might erase the damage with love alone. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in a jail cell with his hands bandaged from burns, his polished image shattered beyond repair. Witnesses from the wedding were interviewed one by one, each confirming the transformation they had seen in his demeanor once Emily revealed the truth. The biochemist who had sniffed the champagne gave sworn testimony about the metallic odor corroborated by lab tests that later confirmed lethal levels of thallium in the glass intended for Olivia. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose around Daniel's neck. Olivia closed her eyes at night, haunted by his voice, but when she opened them each morning, she reminded herself that justice was coming. The journal, the receipts, the poisoned champagne, the blood tests, all of it formed an unbreakable chain. Daniel's secret had been dragged into the light, and now the law would decide his fate. The hospital room became Olivia's world. For the next several weeks, its sterile walls and rhythmic monitors both prison and sanctuary. Every morning began with blood draws of 4 infusions and the burn of chelation drugs as they coursed through her veins. Her body ached constantly, her muscles twitching involuntarily, her hair falling in handfuls onto the white sheets. Mirrors became her enemy. The woman reflected back was no longer the radiant bride she had imagined, but a pale shadow with trembling hands and eyes hollowed by betrayal. At night, Olivia woke in a panic, feeling the phantom pressure of a knife against her throat and hearing Daniel's voice whispering that she already belonged to him. Nurses reassured her, but the fear clung like a second skin. Emily never left her side for long. She slept in an uncomfortable chair, bruises still blooming across her face, refusing to complain. When Olivia whispered that she could not forgive her for setting fire to the cathedral, Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she only squeezed her sister's hand and replied that she would rather be hated than bury her. Their parents visited daily, but instead of comfort, their presence bred tension. Their father, proud and domineering, could not stop lashing out at Emily. He accused her of humiliating the family, of turning their name into fodder for tabloids. He shouted that Olivia would have been fine without her interference, that doctors could have discovered the truth eventually. Their mother wept at every visit, torn between her daughters clinging to rosaries and whispering that she had failed as a mother. The marriage that had already carried cracks now began to crumble. Fights erupted in the waiting room, their voices carrying down sterile hallways as staff whispered about the Carters unraveling. Olivia listened, guilt slicing deeper with each argument. She knew her parents' love for each other had been strained long before, but her near death had widened the fissures into chasms. Their father retreated into anger, their mother into despair. Olivia's survival did not heal them. It revealed how broken they already were. Olivia herself struggled with a new reality. The tremors in her hands made even simple tasks impossible. She dropped utensils, spilled water, and sometimes could not sign her own name. For a surgeon whose identity was built on precision, the loss was devastating. She feared her career was over, that the years of sacrifice and study had been stolen as surely as Daniel had stolen her health. At times, she wanted to give up, to sink into the mattress, and let the treatments run their course without caring. But Emily's presence, stubborn and unyielding, would not allow it. Emily brought her books, coaxed her to eat when nausea stole her appetite, and reminded her daily that she was alive because someone had refused to stay silent. Yet gratitude was tangled with resentment. Olivia hated herself for wavering between anger at Emily for destroying her wedding and awe that Emily had saved her. The contradiction gnawed at her, leaving her sleepless. News coverage only deepened her torment. Images of the burning cathedral filled television screens, her name plastered across headlines about betrayal and attempted murder. Strangers debated her life online, some praising Emily as a hero, others condemning her as reckless. Olivia felt stripped bare, her suffering consumed as entertainment. Paparazzi stalked the hospital entrance, and she dreaded leaving the building. Friends and colleagues visited, their pitying eyes harder to bear than the poison itself. They whispered apologies for not noticing the signs, for dismissing her exhaustion as wedding jitters. Their guilt only mirrored her own blindness. She replayed every moment with Daniel, every time she had trusted him, every meal he had cooked, every glass he had poured. Each memory felt contaminated. Love had been weaponized against her, turned into a slow death. Trust now felt impossible. Nights grew longer, her mind circling the same question: how could she ever let someone close again? Emily pressed her to talk, but Olivia often turned away, burying her face in pillows damp with tears. She could not admit how hollow she felt, how much of her life had been stolen. Weeks later, when she was finally discharged, the fractures in their family became undeniable. Her parents announced they were separating, unable to endure the constant blame. Her father moved out, muttering that he could no longer watch Emily praised while he carried shame. Her mother stayed with Olivia, hovering like a shadow, crying in the kitchen while tea went cold. Olivia realized Daniel had not only tried to kill her, but had poisoned the foundation of her family too. She returned home not to celebration, but to a house filled with silence. Her future uncertain, her body fragile, her trust shattered. The cathedral flames had been extinguished, but the fire he had set inside her life continued to burn, leaving nothing untouched. Olivia's recovery stretched endlessly each day, a slow climb from weakness toward something resembling stability. The tremors in her hands persisted, though less violently, with treatment, and Dr. Lee reassured her that improvement would come gradually, but patience was as bitter as the medicine she swallowed. She forced herself to attend support groups at the insistence of her therapist, though the idea of sitting in a circle of strangers and recounting her humiliation felt unbearable. Yet when she finally went hiding behind a scarf and sunglasses, she discovered a room of survivors whose stories mirrored her own in pain, if not in detail. Among them was Ethan Brooks, a 35-year-old lawyer with gentle eyes who spoke quietly about losing his sister to an abusive marriage. His words were steady but tinged with grief, and Olivia felt a resonance that pierced her isolation. Unlike others who rushed to comfort her with platitudes, Ethan simply listened. After meetings, he walked her to her car, never pressing, never prying, only ensuring she was safe. Weeks turned into months, and his presence became a small light in the gray fog. Olivia hesitated to call it friendship, let alone anything more. but she found herself looking forward to Tuesday nights when the group gathered in the library basement, the scent of cheap coffee and worn books oddly comforting. Emily also began attending therapy compelled by her own trauma. Though she was praised publicly as the savior who had exposed Daniel, the guilt of nearly killing her sister with fire gnawed at her. She confessed to Olivia during late-night talks that she replayed the moment, constantly wondering if there had been another way. Olivia listened, sometimes silent, sometimes angry, sometimes weeping, but gradually the wall between them thinned. They shared memories of childhood, of playing in their backyard before rivalry poisoned their bond. For the first time in years, Olivia saw Emily not as competition, but as the only person who had truly fought for her. Their relationship remained complicated, but healing was stitched slowly through shared vulnerability. Olivia's career hung in the balance, yet she found ways to adapt. Though her hands still trembled, she began mentoring medical students, guiding them through procedures with words rather than scalpels. At first it felt like surrender, but the gratitude in their eyes gave her a sense of purpose she thought had been stolen forever. She realized healing was not about reclaiming the exact life she had lost, but about building something new from the ashes. Outside the hospital walls, the case against Daniel swelled into a spectacle. Reporters dissected every detail, the public hungry for updates. Olivia avoided the noise, focusing instead on rebuilding. Ethan visited more often, sometimes bringing food, sometimes only silence that felt kinder than words. One evening after group therapy, he admitted he had not smiled in years until she laughed at one of his dry jokes. The honesty startled Olivia, her chest tightening with both fear and fragile hope. She did not answer, but she also did not retreat. Slowly, trust sprouted again in soil she thought barren. Her parents' separation remained painful, but even that fractured bond taught Olivia to let go of illusions. She saw clearly now that love without honesty was poison, whether from a spouse or from parents unwilling to face truth. Emily reminded her daily that survival was not weakness but defiance, that every shaky step was a victory. Olivia began keeping a journal, documenting her progress, recording both despair and small triumphs. She wrote about the first time she held a pen steady enough to sign her name again, the first night she slept without nightmares, the first smile she gave without forcing it. Each entry marked another piece of her life reclaimed. The past could not be erased, but the future was hers to shape. Healing was not a straight line, but an undulating path of setbacks and breakthroughs, and Olivia learned to ride its rhythm. With Ethan's quiet support and Emily's fierce loyalty, she discovered that survival was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something stronger. The trial of Daniel Miller became more than a courtroom drama. It transformed into a national reckoning. News stations replayed footage of the burning cathedral, commentators debated the signs of hidden abuse, and articles questioned how someone so respected could have orchestrated such a meticulous attempt on his bride's life. Olivia, though weary of the attention, realized she had been handed a platform larger than she ever wanted. She was invited to speak before the state legislature after months of recovery. Her tremors still faintly visible as she gripped the podium, her hair thinner but her voice steadier than she expected. In the chamber packed with officials and reporters, she described the subtle signs she had ignored, the way exhaustion and confusion had masked the truth and the betrayal of trust that nearly killed her. She argued for reforms that would protect others, mandatory dual notification for large life insurance policies, increased oversight on the sale of toxic substances, and medical reporting protocols for suspected poisoning in domestic settings. The proposal, dubbed the Protective Partners Act, drew attention across the nation. Lawmakers nodded gravely as Olivia spoke, her sister Emily seated proudly in the gallery. Her presence a reminder that sometimes desperation was the only alarm loud enough to save a life. Survivors from across the state reached out afterward, writing letters to Olivia and Emily, thanking them for breaking silence. Some had endured years of manipulation, others bore scars from physical or emotional abuse, all finding courage in their story. Olivia read these letters late into the night, tears blurring the ink, realizing her suffering had become a lifeline for others. Emily, too, was asked to speak at universities and conferences, her fiery spirit now channeled into advocacy. She spoke not as a perfect heroine, but as a flawed sister who had chosen chaos to expose the truth. She admitted her methods were reckless, that she had nearly destroyed the day, but she emphasized the importance of trusting instincts when someone you love is in danger. Her raw honesty resonated deeply with audiences, sparking debates about moral responsibility and the lengths one must go to protect family. Media outlets alternated between vilifying Daniel and dissecting Olivia's private life. Paparazzi hounded her, but instead of retreating, she leaned into transparency, granting interviews that highlighted systemic failures rather than her personal tragedy. She insisted the story was not about her alone, but about every victim unseen. Over time, the narrative shifted from spectacle to social movement. Support groups across the country reported increased attendance, hotlines saw a spike in calls, and lawmakers in other states began drafting similar bills. Olivia's testimony and Emily's advocacy became catalysts for change. Hospitals adopted new protocols, pharmacists faced stricter scrutiny, and financial institutions implemented safeguards to prevent exploitation through secret insurance policies. Olivia sometimes felt overwhelmed by the scope of what had been set in motion, but Ethan reminded her gently that ripples were inevitable when truth collided with silence. Together with Emily, she founded a nonprofit dedicated to supporting survivors of covert abuse, focusing on education, legal aid, and medical awareness. They called it Phoenix Trust, symbolizing rebirth from fire. The organization grew quickly, volunteers joining from across professions, doctors, lawyers, counselors, all inspired by the story that had begun in flames. Olivia discovered a new purpose beyond surgery, channeling her precision and resilience into advocacy. Though her hands still trembled, her voice grew stronger, steadier, and her influence stretched further than she ever imagined. The woman who once saw herself only as a victim of betrayal now stood as a symbol of resilience and reform. What Daniel had intended as her destruction became the foundation of her legacy. When the trial finally opened, the courthouse overflowed with reporters, survivors, and curious citizens drawn by the sensational headlines. Olivia sat in the front row beside Emily, her trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap as she faced the man who had once been her future. Daniel entered, shackled, his burns healed into ugly scars across his hands, his polished appearance replaced by the orange jumpsuit of an inmate. He avoided her eyes, staring straight ahead with a cold mask that only fractured when the prosecutor laid out the mountain of evidence. The journal Emily had recovered was displayed page by page, each entry revealing the chilling calculations of doses and symptoms. Witnesses testified to his deceit, from bridesmaids who had seen powders added to drinks to pharmacists who confirmed his purchases to financial experts who detailed the theft of her savings and the fraudulent insurance policies. The most devastating moment came when laboratory results were presented, proving beyond doubt that Olivia's blood carried lethal levels of thallium, the champagne contained poison, and even her makeup had been tainted. Daniel's defense attempted to paint Emily as unstable, suggesting she had fabricated evidence. But the sheer volume of corroboration crushed their narrative. Even the police chief, Daniel's own uncle, faced charges after records showed he had warned Daniel about Emily's complaint, an act that directly endangered Olivia's life. His presence in the dock alongside Daniel shocked the community, a symbol of corruption unraveling under scrutiny. Olivia's chest tightened when she took the stand. She spoke softly but firmly about her symptoms, her confusion, the betrayal that hollowed her out, and the terror of a knife against her throat in front of hundreds. Her voice cracked, but it did not falter, and when she finished, the courtroom sat in silence, moved by the raw honesty of her ordeal. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. They returned with unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, aggravated assault, poisoning, fraud, and identity theft. The courtroom erupted with gasps and murmurs, but Olivia only felt a heavy release, as though chains she had carried for months had been broken. At sentencing, the judge declared Daniel's crimes among the most calculated and cruel he had seen in decades on the bench. He handed down a sentence of 35 years with no possibility of parole for 25, ensuring Daniel would spend the prime of his life behind bars. The pharmacist who had aided him received 8 years and the permanent loss of his license, while the disgraced police chief was sentenced to 3 years for obstruction of justice and abuse of power. Emily stood beside Olivia as the judge acknowledged her desperate act, ruling that her actions had been a justified emergency measure to prevent murder. She was fully exonerated, her record cleared, and the courtroom applauded her courage. For Olivia, the verdict was both justice and sorrow. She had gained truth, but lost her innocence, had survived, but carried scars that no sentence could erase. As the gavel struck, she looked at Emily and saw the sister who had saved her, not the rival of old. Together, they walked out of the courthouse into the blinding light of cameras, but this time, Olivia lifted her chin, knowing the story was no longer about destruction, but survival vindicated by justice. 3 years passed before Olivia felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The scar on her shoulder remained as a thin reminder of the knife, and the tremors in her hands persisted whenever she was tired, but life had carved a new rhythm. She no longer defined herself by what Daniel had stolen, but by what she had rebuilt. On a spring morning, she stood in a courthouse with Ethan beside her, their vows exchanged in a simple ceremony, attended only by Emily, her mother, and a handful of close friends. There were no chandeliers, no towering altars, no grand audience, only quiet sincerity and the warmth of hands clasped together without deception. Emily smiled through tears, finally free from the guilt that had haunted her, and Olivia felt the bond between them settle into something unshakable. Months later, Olivia gave birth to a daughter, naming her after Dr. Marcus Lee, who had saved her life with relentless care. Holding the child in her arms, she whispered promises of safety and love, vowing her daughter would never doubt her worth or question her protection. Emily became the devoted aunt, filling the house with laughter. Olivia thought she would never hear again. Professionally, Olivia found fulfillment in new ways. Though surgery was no longer possible, she became a mentor and advocate, teaching young doctors not only about medicine, but about vigilance, compassion, and the hidden wounds patients often carry. Her nonprofit Phoenix Trust flourished, offering legal and medical support to survivors across the country. Each success was a testament to survival turned into strength. Ethan stood steadfast at her side, patient when nightmares resurfaced, protective without suffocating his quiet presence, healing in ways words never could. On quiet evenings, Olivia would stand at the window watching her daughter play in the yard, the sound of laughter drifting through the air, and she would whisper the truth she had once feared to believe her sister's fire had given her life back. Emily, too, discovered happiness. She began dating a kind-hearted teacher who admired her fierce honesty and the fire that once terrified the world but now illuminated her purpose. The sisters who had once been rivals now leaned on each other, sharing meals, stories, and memories of a childhood that no longer divided them. Their family, though fractured, found a strange peace. Their mother remarried quietly to a widower who brought calm into her life, and though their father remained distant, Olivia no longer carried his disapproval as a burden. The wedding cathedral had long been rebuilt, but Olivia never returned. Instead, she found her sanctuary in small things: bedtime stories with her daughter, quiet walks with Ethan, conversations with Emily that ended in laughter instead of arguments. On the anniversary of that fateful day, she lit a candle not for mourning but for gratitude, acknowledging the pain while honoring the survival. Looking at her reflection in the flickering flame, she whispered, "My sister set the fire that saved my life. She gave me a second chance." And for the first time since the smoke-filled cathedral, Olivia truly believed it.